Well, hello again. My Bible is open to Job chapter 4. Job chapter 4, and we're going to be reading from that text in just a moment as we consider the first speech of Eliphaz, one of Job's friends who came to sit with him and grieve with him at the end of chapter 2. In chapter 3 of the book of Job, the silence was broken. That 7-day silence where Job was mourning and he was in grief, and his three friends had come to see him, and the text says they sat there with him for 7 days, making no sounds or saying nothing at all. They were so shaken by his grief and his struggling. And in chapter 3, Job speaks out, and he says some things that in some ways are really striking. Why was I even born? Why won't God take my life? In fact, several times in chapter 3, particularly in verses 11 through 26, Job asks the question, why? Several times. Why was I even born? Why did I have to come from the womb? Why were there breasts to nurse me when I was a baby? In other words, I just wish my life had not even begun, or even if it did begin, why couldn't it be cut short? But notice in chapter 3 how many times Job asks the question, why? And isn't that the biggest question that people ask when they're suffering? Why is this happening? Why is God letting these things happen to me? And the things that Job says in chapter 3 are so striking that Eliphaz says, I have to say something. I have to speak. In fact, in chapter 4, he says in verse 2, should anyone try to speak with you when you are exhausted, yet who can keep from speaking? Eliphaz says, I have to say something, even if it's just to keep from saying nothing. And sometimes we feel like that. We feel like somebody needs to say something. I may not exactly be sure what I should say, but because something needs to be said, I'm going to speak up and say something. And Eliphaz recognizes that Job is just in immense pain and suffering. And so he's going to attempt, in this first speech from Job's friends, he is going to attempt to give Job some comfort. And he's going to say some things that are generally true, but he's also going to say some things that specifically, when applied to Job's situation, are not true. And as we think about that, a general truth that he states, when specifically applied, is not a truth. I think it's important for us to remember this. You and I, having the scriptures in front of us, we are able to see the whole story right from the very beginning. We're told in chapter 1 that the sons of God, or angels, presented themselves before the Lord, and the devil was also there before the Lord. And there was a dialogue between God and Satan. And it happens again in chapter 2. This is going on in the spiritual realm. Job can't see this. Job's friends don't have any idea what's going on behind the scenes. They have no idea the conversations that are taking place in the presence of God. All they know is what has befallen Job. All they are privy to is what Job has experienced on earth. You and I have the benefit of the rest of the story. We have all of the details. And so we can sit here and read the things that Job says. We can read the things that Eliphaz and others say, but we have a perspective that they don't have. And it's really important that we keep that in mind. So when Eliphaz speaks, he tries to give Job some comfort. And again, he says some things that are generally true. But because of the prologue of the book, the first 2 chapters, the things that Eliphaz says, which are generally true, they cannot possibly be applied to Job because of what the prologue has already told us about Job's character, his integrity, and his desire to honor God. So let's read together Job chapter 4, the first portion of Eliphaz's speech. His whole speech actually is chapters 4 and 5. And depending on how we're doing on time, we might go ahead and sneak in chapter 5 as well. But let's read chapter 4, verse 3. Indeed, he says to Job, you have instructed many and have strengthened weak hands. Your words have steadied the one who was stumbling and braced the knees that were buckling. But now that this has happened to you, you have become exhausted. It strikes you and you are dismayed. He says, Job, you have helped a lot of people for a long time. You've given counsel to others when tragedy has befallen them. You have given good advice to other people when these bad things have happened to them. But now that it's happened to you, you don't know what to do with yourself. And I think he's pointing Job back to what Job has just said in chapter 3, where Eliphaz, it seems, is just surprised at some of these things that Job would say. Job, you would have never counseled somebody else to curse the day that they were born. You would have never said, God, take my life. You've given good counsel to other people, but now that it's fallen upon you, you're saying these crazy things. In verse 6, isn't your piety your confidence and the integrity of your life your hope? Now, Eliphaz is here in verse 7 going to start to speak some of this general truth. Verse 7, consider, who has perished when he was innocent? Where have the honest been destroyed? In my experience, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble reap the same. They perish at a single blast from God and come to an end by the breath of his nostrils. Isn't Eliphaz's observation there generally true? Pardon me, I dropped a book out of my lap. His statements there are generally true. The people who die early in life, or the people who suffer greatly in life, are the people who have brought it upon themselves. They're the people who have sown iniquity. They are the ones who are doing things that they should not be doing, and as a punishment, as an act of justice, they are getting what they deserve. Now, there is some truth to that statement, right? We see the news and we see tragedy of a young person who dies in a car accident. And maybe that car accident is due to the fact that they've been drinking. They were driving under the influence of alcohol. They didn't have their judgment or their coordination about them. They made a bad decision while driving impaired, and it cost them their life. And that's a tragic thing, but it could have been avoided. Or we could provide other examples, I'm sure, but when we see those who are pursuing evil and unrighteousness, as Eliphaz says in verse 8, those who are plowing injustice and sowing trouble, we're not surprised when they perish or when they suffer the consequences of their choices. And so Eliphaz is speaking about this, and he's really starting to apply this to Job. You must have done something wrong. You must have fallen into sin. Eliphaz knows that Job is a good man. I don't think Eliphaz is accusing him of pursuing a life of wickedness and unrighteousness. He's already said, Job, you've given good counsel to others. You've been a strengthener of those who were weak and so forth, as he said in earlier verses. But he sees Job as someone who, although generally godly and generally righteous in his character, he has fallen into sin and wickedness. He has slipped up in weakness, and he has pursued injustice or trouble, such as he says in verse 8. Now, in verses 12 and following, Eliphaz is going to reveal to Job that he has had a dream. He's had a vision. And there's a lot of discussion and debate about, well, two things, I think. One, was this a true vision or dream that came to him from God, as God was prone to do with his prophets? Or was this just a personal dream and vision that Eliphaz had while he was asleep? And another thing is, when did he have this vision or this dream? Was it during the 7-day period when he was watching Job suffer and mourn? Or was this sometime before? Is he talking about a dream that maybe he had a long time ago that he is using to reinforce what he's just stated? I don't think that really matters when he had this vision or this dream. But he says things in here that he uses to bolster what he has already said. Verse 12, a word was brought to me in secret. My ears caught a whisper of it. Among unsettling thoughts from visions in the night, when deep sleep comes over men, fear and trembling came over me and made all my bones shake. I had this awful nightmare. I saw this in a dream, and it just really put fear into me. In verse 15, I felt a draft on my face, and the hair on my body stood up. A figure stood there, but I could not recognize its appearance. A form loomed before my eyes. I heard a whispering voice. Can a mortal be righteous before God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? If God puts no trust in his servants and he charges his angels with foolishness, how much more those who dwell in clay houses, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth? They are smashed to pieces from dawn to dusk. They perish forever while no one notices. Are their tent cords not pulled up? They die without wisdom. This is what he saw in this vision in the night. Can a mortal man be more just than God? He asked in verse 17. And I think that's an important question that he is trying to convey here to Job. You are questioning, back to chapter 3, when Job first spoke, you are questioning, why is God doing the things that he's doing? Why are these things happening? And he says, when you ask that question, he seems to think that maybe that's an indictment against God on Job's part. You're speaking out against the Lord and what he is planning and what he is doing, and you shouldn't do that. Mortal man has no better judgment than God. You can't be more righteous in your judgment than the Almighty is. And certainly that's true. We are not more just and more righteous than God. Now, as we go on into chapter 5, and I probably shouldn't do it for the sake of time, but I don't think I'm going to have a chance to do a video tomorrow, so we'll try to go ahead and get chapter 5 here. Eliphaz continues his speech, and he gives a warning to Job here. In verse 2 of chapter 5, he says, for anger kills a fool, and the jealousy slays the gullible. Jealousy slays the gullible. Job, you need to watch out that you don't let all of your suffering turn you into this bitter, resentful person. Some of your translations might use the word vexation, and the idea is just this: you're driven to the point of this bitter resentment. And he says that would kill a foolish man, and jealousy would kill someone who is gullible. In other words, Job, you're talking like a foolish man. The things you said in chapter 3, that's what foolish people say. You shouldn't talk like that. And he gives him this warning. You keep going down that path, and you're going to end up in a place that you don't want to be. Now, I'm not going to read through chapter 5, again, just for the sake of time, but I do want to point out something. In chapter 5 and verse 8, that forms a new section or a new thought in Eliphaz's speech to Job. And he's going to give the counsel to Job that Job should seek the Lord, that he should turn to God, and that he should accept this chastisement, this discipline from God, and use that to turn back to God. Okay? So, think about what we read a moment ago in chapter 4. Those who are unrighteous find trouble. Those who are wicked find their lives being cut short, and that general truth. So, another general truth is mankind should seek the Lord. You should turn to God. Well, that's generally true. But again, the problem is we can't specifically apply that to Job. Because what did God say about Job in the prologue? There's no one like him on all the earth. He's the best human being on the planet. He is upright. He's a man of integrity. And so these general statements that Eliphaz is making, they don't apply to Job. The scriptures tell us on the first 2 pages of the book of Job, it's not because of his sin that he is suffering. That's not applicable. But remember, Eliphaz doesn't have the prologue. He doesn't have the first 2 pages of the story like you do and like I do. Notice in verse 8, chapter 5. However, if I were you, I would appeal to God and would present my case to him. A couple of things I want to mention about that verse. First of all, notice that expression, if I were you. But as for me, here's what I would do. Think about question number 4 from our list of questions to read. How can we use this chapter to help someone who's hurting? Here's a negative example. Here's an example of what not to do. Well, if I were you, it's so easy for us to go there. We do this all the time. We see someone who is hurting, we see someone who's in pain, and we say, well, if it was me, here's what I would do. I think the obvious application of this comes with someone maybe who, let's say they have cancer, late stage, most likely terminal cancer. And they're given the options, right? You either have 6 months to live, or you can go through these chemo and radiation treatments, and maybe it will get you another 3 to 6 months. You know, you're looking at 6 months or a year or so. And for us who are not dealing with cancer and not facing that grim outlook from our medical counsel, we say, I know what I would do. I would never take those treatments. I would have a better quality of life, even if it meant shorter life. It's so easy for us to do that. Well, if it were me, here's what I would do. We see the problem with that, right? The problem is simply this. It's not you. I'm not the one in that circumstance. I have no idea what I would actually do if I was faced with that circumstance. And so Eliphaz stands before Job, a man who has just lost everything of value to him, a man who's lost his children, his possessions, everything. And Eliphaz comes along and says, well, if I were you, here's what I think you should do. Wow. We really need to be careful when we start to say something like that. Here's a second thing I want you to consider from verse 8. I would appeal to God and would present my case to him. Job, you need to just ask the Lord why these things have happened. Bring your case before God and talk to him. Now, Eliphaz doesn't realize it, but this is prophetic because that's exactly what Job is going to do, and we're going to come to that later in the book. Underline that now, and remember, Eliphaz said this back in chapter 5. We're going to see this again later on. Now, in the following verses, verse 9 down through verse 16, Eliphaz is going to just give some rationale behind his statement in verse 8. I would appeal to God and present my case before him because, and then he follows the next several verses with reasons as to why. Think about, I believe it's our third question, what things are said about God in these chapters. There's lots of good stuff in these verses. All right, now let's move on down. Look at verse 17. Here is where we start to get Eliphaz's his view of Job and what's going on. Verse 17. See how happy is the person whom God corrects. So do not reject the discipline of the Almighty. Job, if you accept God's correction, you will be a blessed man. God is chastising you. God is disciplining you. And so his counsel to Job is you need to give yourself over and submit to God's chastisement. Don't push back. Don't rebel against it. You need to accept it because God knows what you do not. He knows what I do not. You need to accept what God is doing here. Now, again, Eliphaz says some things here that are generally true, but they don't apply to Job. And I want you to think about Eliphaz's speech from Job's perspective. Job has lived his entire life in integrity before God. He knows that he has not turned to wickedness and evil. He has not pursued a path of injustice or unrighteousness. That is not what he has done. And yet Eliphaz stands up and says, well, bad things only happen to people who deserve them. Bad things happen to unrighteous and wicked and godless people, so you should turn back to God. Now, again, I don't think Eliphaz sees Job as just this extremely wicked person, but he's saying, hey, look, you've slipped up. You've slipped. You've fallen. In a moment of weakness, you've gone down the wrong path. You need to turn back to God. You need to accept God's discipline. Generally true, general good advice, but that's not what's happened here, and Job knows it. And so Eliphaz's speech to Job must come across to him as extremely callous and insulting. You're making these charges about what I've done and that I've, somehow pursued righteousness or unrighteousness, and that's not at all the case. So again, think about our questions that we're asking as we're reading each day. What are we saying to those who are hurting? What are we not saying to those who are hurting? What are the implications of our statements when we do speak to those who are hurting? These discussions, these speeches that are given by Job and his friends, they are so helpful to us as we think about how best to interact with those who are in pain. That's Eliphaz's first speech. And when we come over to Job chapter 6, Job is going to give a response. And we'll look forward to doing that next week. Thank you for reading with me today. And let me mention one other thing before I close our video for today. I've done 3 videos this week in our first week of daily Bible reading. I've covered every chapter that we have read this week, at least in some detail. I'm not sure what schedule I'm going to keep. I make no promise that I'm going to cover every book, or every chapter of the book, rather. I'm going to do at least 2 videos a week. I hope. That's my plan. I may do 3, I may do 4, I don't know. And it also may be determined by how long or short a chapter is as to how many I cover. What I'm saying to you is it's kind of changing. It's flexible. I don't know. I can't tell you, hey, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 10 o'clock, there's going to be a video. I can't do that. My schedule is just so full of things that change from day to day, and I just can't do anything that's that concrete anymore. But there will be videos, hopefully at least 2 a week, maybe 3 if I'm feeling really good, but I'll do my best to let you know when they're published and made available. Thanks for reading along with me today. God bless you.